Imagine standing on a bombed-out street in a German city in the spring of 1944. Buildings gutted, tramlines twisted, smoke still rising from ruins. Intuitively, you expect the enemy's war effort to be crumbling, that each ruined factory, each shattered rail bridge, brings the Allied victory closer. Yet by the eve of D-Day, something strange was happening. In certain critical metrics, Germany had, paradoxically, become in some ways leaner, more focused, and, if only for a time, harder to stop. How could a campaign designed to cripple an enemy's capacity sometimes produce the opposite effect? Make a prediction now. Did Allied bombing, on balance, only weaken Germany, or did it also force adaptations that made parts of the German war machine stronger before June 1944? The thesis is counterintuitive but concrete. Allied strategic bombing inflicted enormous damage and cumulative strain on Germany, yet it also triggered a series of institutional and organizational responses: centralization of priorities, dispersal and redundancy, enforced labor mobilization, technical workarounds and selective target misalignments, that for a limited period produced increased survivability or concentrated military output in certain areas. Those second-order effects did not cancel the larger strategic damage. They did, however, alter how German industry and logistics functioned in ways that complicated Allied expectations and, in some cases, made German forces more capable of resisting the invasion that came on June 6, 1944. If you want analysis that looks at systems, not just battles, subscribe. To evaluate this claim, we need to define what we mean by stronger. Strength is not a single number. It can mean tactical effectiveness on a particular front, the ability to field specific weapons on schedule, the resilience of logistics networks, or the efficiency with which scarce materials are converted into combat power. Allied planners sought to break German strength across multiple axes, destroy industrial capacity, sever transport links, choke fuel supplies, and undermine morale. The British Royal Air Force often favored area attacks aiming at industrial cities and morale. The US 8th Air Force pushed for daylight precision strikes against specific industrial targets and transportation nodes. Germany before 1943 was stretched, resource-poor, dependent on synthetic fuel programs, and organized with a mixture of private firms and state control. Bombing sought to exploit those weaknesses. But warfare is a dynamic contest of action and reaction. The Allies' blunt instrument did something more than remove production capacity. It provoked German institutions to reorganize. To make sense of how bombing sometimes had strengthening effects, we'll move through a set of mechanisms, each illustrated by short anecdotes and supported by historiographical caveats, before showing how they combined into a larger, ambiguous picture. First, centralization and prioritization. Firestorms and shattered factories forced German planners into triage. When vital plants were hit, Berlin and the Armaments Ministry had to answer a simple, brutal question: what do we keep running, and what do we abandon? Under Armaments Minister Albert Speer, whose post-war memoirs are useful but contested, production was increasingly centralized and prioritized towards specific military programs. This was not a moral defense of the regime. It was a cold administrative response. Allocate scarce steel, machine tools and skilled labor to the items deemed most crucial: fighters, certain tank types and critical munitions, while deprioritizing consumer goods and some civilian industries. One anonymous wartime foreman later recalled in interrogation how entire workshops were stripped and retooled to build aircraft components overnight. The labor was redirected, the schedules tightened, and managers who had previously overseen diverse civilian output now only served single military lines. The immediate consequence of prioritization was an efficiency spike in those chosen sectors. When resources are concentrated, throughput can rise rapidly because bottlenecks are removed and attention is focused. In the spring of 1944, some indicators, production tallies reported to German armaments authorities, showed increased outputs in particular categories compared with earlier months. These figures are debated and need careful verification. That surge did not reflect a nationwide renaissance. It reflected a reallocation of limited inputs toward the most militarily valuable outputs. The paradox is familiar to any operations manager. Starve the less important processes, and the core product appears to flourish. Second, dispersal and redundancy. Allied raids demonstrated the vulnerability of large centralized factories. In response, German firms and the state initiated massive dispersal efforts, moving production into smaller satellite plants, subcontracting pieces to small workshops and, in some instances, relocating work underground into caves, mines, or purpose-built subterranean complexes. The visual of a smoke-stained factory floor was replaced by scores of tiny anonymous workshops in barns, basements, and industrial suburbs where specialized tasks continued. That dispersal increased redundancy. A single raid could no longer stop an entire assembly line because the line's components were spread across a network. The trade-off was efficiency. Dispersed production was harder to manage and slower per unit, but it became much more resilient to single-point destruction. A practical anecdote helps illuminate the mechanics. A captured transport officer in 1944 described how a destroyed parts plant in a medium-sized city was replaced by a dozen rural subcontractors. Spare parts that had once shipped by direct rail now arrived in bales on slower roads, then by truck to assembly nodes where technicians, often with minimal equipment, carried out last-stage fitting and inspection. Output per worker went down, but the aggregate flow, because it came from many independent sources, could continue. That patchwork system made it harder for Allied bombing to create an immediate production arrest. It required repeated, widespread attacks on many small sites instead of a few large addressable targets. Third, mobilization and state control. Bombing sharpened the state's appetite for control. To keep factories running, the Nazi regime intensified labor conscription, deploying millions of foreign and forced laborers and reinforcing strict work discipline. This moral atrocity must always be emphasized. The regime's survival strategies involved coercion, deportation, and exploitation at enormous human cost. From a narrow production standpoint, forced labor made it possible to staff dispersed workshops and to replace casualties in factories and transport units. However, the quality, skill levels, and motivation of coerced labor were often poor. Productivity gains from mobilization were therefore uneven and sometimes illusory. Nonetheless, in specific prioritized lines, where skilled personnel were concentrated, forced mobilization moved the needle. If a plant required thousands of hands to bolster a final assembly push for fighters or tanks, the state's coercive reach could temporarily deliver them. Fourth, technological and organizational adaptation. Bombing catalyzed innovation in process and protection. Night shifts, camouflage, rapid repair units, and increased maintenance discipline were all measures employed to blunt air attacks. Railways developed quick repair techniques for bridges. Factories adopted blackout measures and dummy structures to mislead bomber crews. In some cases, German engineers produced clever logistical workarounds, rerouting traffic, building bypasses, and improvising transfer methods that stretched precious resources thinner but kept essential flows moving. These adaptations were not permanent structural advantages. They were stopgaps that increased survivability in the short term. Fifth, Allied operational limits and target selection. The bombing campaign was not a monolith. It was an ensemble of tactics with competing priorities. The British area raids sought to break morale and destroy urban industrial complexes. American daylight raids favored transportation and specific plants. Weather, intelligence gaps, and accuracy limitations often meant that raids missed intended high-value targets or struck peripheral assets. Sometimes the Allies focused on targets that would inflict long-term pain, but had only modest immediate military payoff, at least in the months before D-Day. At other times, German strategic depth and stockpiles protected critical items despite attacks. The upshot, uneven pressure coupled with German adaptation, allowed some sectors to preserve or even augment output temporarily. Let's ground these mechanisms in a few focused case studies that illustrate how the dynamics played out in practice. Aircraft production is the clearest and most frequently cited example. From late 1943 into the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe faced relentless pressure. Yet at the departmental level, fighter production, fueled by prioritized allocation of machine tools, steel, and skilled workers, showed notable monthly gains when compared with earlier periods. Historians debate exact figures. These require sourcing. The concentration of effort meant that while some sectors withered, the fighter lines benefited from a disproportionate share of remaining capacity. The operational consequence was that, as Allied air operations intensified in 1944, German fighter opposition remained robust enough to impose higher losses on attacking formations than many planners had expected. That did not mean the Luftwaffe was winning the air war. It meant that prioritization and reallocation made it a more formidable adversary during critical months. The ball-bearing campaign is a classic historiographical debate that maps cleanly onto the theme of unintended effects. Allied efforts to disrupt German ball-bearing production, most famously the Schweinfurt raids, aimed to break the mechanical backbone that supported multiple industries. Some contemporary Allied assessments assumed that destroying those plants would have cascading effects. In reality, German industry and logistics often mitigated the damage through stockpiles, substitution, and local repairs. Moreover, dispersal measures and reallocation of bearings where they mattered most could reduce the strategic effect. Historians remain divided on how decisive those raids were. The episode highlights a broader point. Damage to one node in a network can be absorbed if the network has redundancy or if the state reallocates scarce items to priority uses. Synthetic oil, Germany's lifeline, illustrates asymmetry over time. The Allies recognized fuel as a center of gravity and, by mid-1944, intensified attacks on synthetic refineries. That campaign eventually caused catastrophic shortages. But prior to D-Day, German mitigation efforts, temporary stockpiles, repair prioritization, and operational rationing helped sustain operations longer than some Allied planners anticipated. Those measures were stopgaps and came at growing cost. But until the bombing definitively strangled synthesis capacity later in 1944, Germany could keep fielding armored formations, albeit in constrained numbers. Again, temporary resilience existed, not invulnerability. Rail and transportation form a third comparative study. Rail networks were the obvious target for any campaign seeking to immobilize a nation. The Allies bombed marshalling yards, rail bridges, and junctions to disrupt troop movements and supply. In response, German railway units developed highly practiced repair routines, and local improvisation, shunting, temporary trestles, and alternate routings kept crucial segments moving. Our captured railway inspector reported in 1944 that repair brigades could restore traffic in days where a single decisive blow had been expected to cripple a region. This account should be checked against archival sources. The net effect was a degradation of efficiency, longer transit times, congestion, and rationing, but not an immediate cessation of strategic mobility. For the period before D-Day, that degradation often proved manageable enough to move reinforcements and materiel in response to Allied threats. These examples illuminate a recurring dynamic. Bombing produced acute shocks that prompted concentrated administrative responses. Those responses improved specific outputs or preserved critical functions for a limited period. But there were costs. Concentration created new vulnerabilities. Once a sector or region was consolidated, it became a high payoff target whose destruction would be far more damaging once the Allies identified it. Dispersal reduced efficiency and increased wear on machinery. Forced labor, while augmenting heads on the line, eroded quality and moral legitimacy. And the resources consumed in adaptation, camouflage, repair crews, transport rerouting, were resources never used to expand production. This tension sets the stage for the central synthesis. Strength must be measured across dimensions and timeframes. In the months leading to D-Day, bombing-induced adaptations allowed Germany to field a more focused, if narrower, military capability in certain domains. Fighters were produced with grim efficiency. Some tank and anti-aircraft lines remained functional. Transportation stayed operational enough to permit troop movements when required. Those capacities helped Germany mount stern resistance in locales and inflicted costs on Allied operations. But this should not be mistaken for strategic recovery. The adaptations were band-aids on a hemorrhage. They consumed material, human capital, and administrative energy. The moral and human costs of the regime's methods, forced labor, repression, and disregard for civilian life, must always be foregrounded. Any strength achieved through such means is a brutal, ethically bankrupt resilience. It is also crucial to note the role of timing. The Allies' strategic bombing campaign was cumulative. While the adaptations discussed could preserve output for months, they were less effective against relentless, well-targeted pressure sustained across an extended period. By late 1944 and into 1945, Allied attacks on oil, transportation and industry, coupled with the pressures of a two-front ground war, overwhelmed German defenses. The strengthening effects were transient. Long-term strategic decline remained the dominant trajectory. Institutional rivalry inside Germany shaped how these adaptations unfolded. Competing priorities between the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, the SS and armaments ministries meant scarce resources were fought over. This political economy of allocation sometimes produced paradoxical outcomes. Units with political protection or perceived frontline prestige got supplies and priority, while others were left to wither. Hitler's micromanagement and ideological preferences affected these distributions, and they could both help and hinder military effectiveness. A field commander might receive a late allocation of tanks that made his local defense more tenable at great systemic cost elsewhere. That localized gain illustrates how political incentives and bureaucratic rivalry can create temporary advantages, again, at the price of sustainability. What lessons follow for how we read military strategy and history? First, actions aimed at destruction often have complex ripple effects. Destroy the hum of an economy, and you change the incentives of those who must keep fighting. They centralize, disperse, coerce, and innovate. Powerful strategies must anticipate not only the immediate physical damage they cause, but also the institutional responses they will provoke. Second, effectiveness is multidimensional. Tactical success, destroying a factory, does not automatically translate into strategic victory if the enemy reconfigures the system to preserve critical output. Third, moral context matters. The German responses that made certain outputs temporarily resilient depended on coercion and brutal policies. Acknowledging their tactical effect in no way mitigates their atrocity. Finally, let's return to the initial paradox and the strategic question behind it. Did Allied bombing make Germany stronger before D-Day? The honest answer is complex. In specific, measurable ways and for a limited time, bombing produced adaptations that temporarily increased survivability or concentrated military output in prioritized sectors. Those effects complicated Allied planning and required invasions and combined operations to exploit. They did not alter the long-term direction of the war. They did, however, reveal a crucial truth about high-intensity industrial warfare. The enemy will change the game. The measures that preserved German capabilities were expensive, morally reprehensible, and ultimately unsustainable. But they were effective enough for a time to sharpen the German war machine into a harder-to-predict adversary. Any historical account that asserts straightforward causality here should be viewed skeptically. Many numerical claims about production, monthly outputs, and losses are contested. Historians still debate the magnitude and timing of these effects, and specific figures should be verified against primary sources. Some names and claims that circulate in oral histories and transcripts have been corrupted and require careful archival confirmation. The responsible historian treats the evidence as provisional, qualified, and subject to revision. If there is a practical takeaway for strategists and thinkers today, it is about anticipating second-order consequences. In complex systems, damage begets adaptation. An enemy's improvised resilience can turn an apparently successful campaign into a strategic muddle, unless planners anticipate how institutions will respond, where they will concentrate their scarce resources, and what moral costs they are willing to endure. Reading the strategic bombing campaign through that lens offers a deeper understanding of why D-Day and the months that preceded it played out the way they did. Because the Allied air offensive was both immensely damaging and, unexpectedly, a catalyst for bitter, costly, and temporarily effective German responses. So what do you think? Did Allied bombing help or hurt Germany before D-Day, on balance and in the short run? Drop your answer below and subscribe for more deep dives that look beyond battles and into the systems that make and break wars.